The last few weeks have seen protests across the country after the Ministry of Defense announced that there would be a scheme called Agnipath. It almost seems as if there is fire on the roads. And to talk about the current situation, the reasons behind this scheme being brought in, and how this could impact the combat readiness of the Indian Armed Forces, we are joined at the India Today East Conclave by the Eastern Army Commander Lt General Rana Kalita, a man who understands the lay of the land here, particularly in the East and elsewhere. And we'll talk to him about the scheme in great detail. General Kalita, welcome, and it's great to have you with us at the India Today Conclave East. We're literally in your backyard, so it's fantastic being here. I want to start by asking you about the kind of protests that we saw when all of you were busy with the task of formulating the contours of the Agnipath scheme. Did you at that time anticipate that there could be an adverse reaction of this nature and protest in so many parts of the country?
Firstly, Rahul, thank you so much for giving me this opportunity of coming over here at the India Today Conclave East and presenting the views of the armed forces in this August forum. As far as your question is concerned, I think there was a lot of deliberations before this scheme was finally announced on 14th of June. And all the pros and cons were discussed and deliberated and wargamed, as we say in the army parlance. But what resulted in form of protest, some of them violent, was primarily, I would say, a law and order situation. There could be many reasons which could be ascribed to it. But primarily, I would like to say that it was because of misunderstanding or the not having a correct perspective of the scheme as such by the majority of the youth who had taken part in the protest at the initial stage. However, after initial 2-3 days, when the various facets of the scheme as such was explained to the environment, including the masses and the youth have started understanding that it's a good scheme which is going to be beneficial to all the youth of the country, the protests have started dying down. And you would be aware that recently the notification for the Army, Navy and Air Force has already been issued. And as within first 4 days for the Air Force, about 1 lakh people had registered for getting into the Agniveers scheme of the Air Force. As also recently it has come out that about 10,000 women have registered for Navy. So I think that things have, people have understood that it's a good scheme and they're coming around. The youth particularly are quite, seemingly quite interested in this scheme to come and join the forces.
But one of the points for discord seems to be this perception that this is an attempt to reduce the strength of the armed forces, which in some ways it is, because if you see how technology is changing with so much drone warfare, which we saw in the battle between Armenia and Azerbaijan, we're seeing that now between Russia and Ukraine, there is nothing wrong with what the army is trying to do. You need a leaner, more agile, meaner, tech-friendly armed forces. And yet somehow in the communication, this aspect of making the armed forces more tech-friendly and reducing the strength of our standing army is not being highlighted, creating doubts about whether this is just an effort to reduce pension outlays.
No, yes, I'll take that question, because what you rightly said was with the infusion of technology, we need to change. Not only the armed forces, every organization has to change with times. And with growing development in technology, we need to restructure ourselves, including the armed forces, create new structures which can absorb the technology and move with times and be better prepared to fight a future battle. So that's the basic concept. However, this exercise which has been carried out, it's primarily a human resources management exercise which resulted into declaring of the Agnipath scheme. It is not, I would say, not an exercise basically aimed at reducing the pension budget. However, having said that, it is also a fact that this particular exercise is going to lead on to certain reduction in the revenue side of the Indian Army budget or the armed forces budget, which can then be gainfully used for capability enhancement and more sort of technology infusion into the armed forces. So that is what we are looking at. It's not about economics primarily. It's an HR resources management exercise.
But linked to this, in several parts of the country, particularly where we saw the protests in places like Bihar and elsewhere, is the reality that there is a whole ecosystem of young personnel who train very hard for a year, sometimes two, in the hope that they will join the armed forces, in the hope that once they are in the armed forces, their future is secure. That the idea was that we take care of the country for 15 years and the country takes care of us for the rest of our lives. That pact between the armed forces and these young boys and girls seems to be broken.
No, you see, that concept of joining the forces for stability in life, that has been in existence throughout. However, we need to change with time, and as you had rightly mentioned, that we need to, review the force structure with the technology development that is taking place all over the world. If you look at the scheme per se, even after 4 years of an Agniveer being in the force, he has got number of opportunities. Firstly, once he finishes his terms of engagement of 4 years, you get a disciplined, well-motivated and skilled person who is churned out back into the society. And he has got various options. When you see the package that is being given, that's called the 780 package, which gives him certain financial stability so that he can start his own entrepreneur project with that fund. He's also eligible for soft bank loans at reduced, interest rates, which he can use to pursue his entrepreneur scaling. As also, there are a lot of skills that are being given to him while in service, as also certain bridging courses which are being planned after he leaves after 4 years.
Sure,
so
but
that
all of this is not certain.
absorbed.
There is no certainty. Like when you're in the armed forces with an assured pension after 15 years of service, you have a certain certainty of pension and savings. Here, yes, you will be given preferential treatment in the Central Armed Police Forces or the State Police Forces or even state government jobs, but there is no guarantee. So for a youngster, it feels like he's back in a queue once again.
No, that's not really true. Because he is being skilled, and his options are, in case, I would look at it from a different perspective. In fact, his options for gaining employment increases manifold after having joined as an Agniveer. Thereafter, he can, after having spent 4 years, he can join any number of avenues. A lot of avenues open up for him. So I would look at it from that particular perspective.
In the investigations that have been carried out by the armed forces and the police about these protests, do you think that some of this was orchestrated? That we've heard the names of coaching institutes come out. Do you think some of this was planned, or do you think it was a spontaneous outburst?
I think I would not like to comment much on that, because it being a law and order situation, which was, I think, handled very well by the state polices wherever these protests had taken place.
Give us a sense of how the nature of the armed forces will change once the Agnipath scheme comes in. Because our current average age of the soldier in the army, for example, is in the early 30s. You want to try and bring this down to the mid-20s. How many years will it be before we're able to achieve this object?
You see, initial recruitment process is starting from this year, wherein we are taking in about 40,000 Agniveers. And for first 2 years, it is 40,000, and thereafter there is an incremental increase in the number of intakes that are going to take place on year-on-year basis. So what is being planned is by about some mid-2030s, the ratio would reach to about 50% of Agniveers in the entire armed forces. At the initial stage, for first 2 years, say at the unit level, there would be about maximum of 20 to 30 Agniveers. So their assimilation and integration into the units as such will not be a very, very difficult proposition. However, as we go along, the number is going to increase to about 50%. But even then, I don't foresee any problem in their integration into functioning and retaining the operational efficiency of the armed forces.
One of the big points of criticism has been the suddenness with which the entire recruitment process was changed. And many, including former generals, have come out to say, why didn't the Army, Navy and Air Force introduce this as a pilot project initially, get people used to the idea that recruitment was changing rather than try to push this through in one instance?
I believe that issue was deliberated while the scheme was being studied at different level in the Armed Forces Headquarters as well as the Ministry of Defense. And thereafter, a very, very conscious and deliberate decision was taken to announce the scheme. And because, as you are aware, that last 2 years, because of COVID, there was no recruitment which was taking place. So that time was utilized primarily to fine-tune this particular scheme, and a conscious decision was taken to announce it on 14 June so that it is applicable from that day onwards for all across.
Now, one of the key aspects of being in a regiment in the army is this whole idea of regimental izzat and pride, and the concern that 2.5, 3 years of service is too little to be able to imbue the culture and the values. And in an actual combat situation, we are here in the eastern part of the country, across in Arunachal and Assam, we have the PLA facing us on the other side. Would we rather have people with 8-10 years of service confident that the Jawan next to them is as committed to the task of defending the country as he is, as opposed to the fear that somebody is just here for 4 years and could take this as one job in a whole career and not something which is his ultimate objective to live?
There are 2-3 aspects to answer to these questions. Firstly, like this scheme aims at improving the youthful profile of the armed forces. Like you had mentioned earlier, the average age being brought down from 32 to 26. However, we are also conscious of the fact that there has to be a very fine balance between the youth and the experience. So like I had mentioned earlier, the maximum number of Agniveers, that is the young soldiers that are going to be there, are to be capped at about 50%. And we have seen that, like you had mentioned about the challenges posed by the PLA across the northern borders. Across all along the northern borders, we have got very, very, very difficult terrain in which we have to operate. So we need very, very fit young soldiers to operate in those areas. And I feel that those fit and young soldiers led by experienced leaders would be able to pay us huge dividends. To quote a personal example, when I was a young captain, our unit was deployed to Sri Lanka. And just before moving to Sri Lanka, my unit received a batch of 100 young soldiers. So we had gone to Sri Lanka with 100 soldiers who had just finished their recruitment. And they gave a very good account of themselves during the entire stay at Sri Lanka, during the difficult operations which were taken on during Uptake.
No, but that's for an infantry style tasking. But take, for example, somebody in the Navy or the Air Force, or even in the more technical parts of the Indian Army, mechanized infantry, or the Armored Corps, or the technical services. There, it takes a certain number of years to understand the full gamut of operations. And just as you're beginning to get the hang of it, 75% are told goodbye and thank you.
Yeah, you are talking about particular technical traits. Yes, they require certain amount of training. However, to ensure that we have requisite trained people, what is being done is most of the recruitment which we are looking at are from the ITI graduates and who are already trained in those particular trades. So they are already skilled. What is required to be imparted to them is the basic military training, and thereafter certain hands-on experience on dealing with this equipment or handling of this equipment, and thereafter as good as they are trained soldiers. So that aspect is being catered for by taking in some skilled people from the various ITIs.
Could I use this opportunity, General Kalita, to also ask you 1 or 2 general questions about your understanding of the state of the situation along India's border in the northeast with China? We saw in 2020, post the Galwan incident, there was a lot of tension all along from eastern Ladakh to Arunachal Pradesh. What's your general overview of how things are this summer?
Yes, this year what we have seen is all along the northern borders, particularly in Eastern Theatre, the situation is quite stable. However, as you all are aware that the IB or the border along the Indo-China border is not clearly demarcated on ground, because of which there are differing perceptions about the alignment of the border. That leads to frictions at times, but however, we have got certain well-established border management mechanism. Whenever there is a friction, these border management mechanism is resorted to. We have a system of flag meeting where the commanders from both sides come and meet, talk, discuss the issue, and all these pinpricks are removed. So those are being managed properly, and I would like to sum up by saying that the situation this summer is likely to be stable.
That's important that you're saying that the situation is stable, because we've seen some reports of border villages coming up, extra infrastructure being built. How much of an additional security challenge is that for you as Eastern Commander?
Yes, there is an infrastructure differential between us and the Chinese as far as the Eastern Theater is concerned, because of we all understand, because of the remoteness of the areas of our responsibility, that is in Sikkim and in Arunachal Pradesh. However, on the other side, Chinese have carried out focused infrastructure development, which includes construction of roads, helipads, improvements of airports, as also dual-use military infrastructure like the border villages. However, I would like to say that in last about 10-12 years, even on own side, there has been a lot of focus on development of the border infrastructure. We also have better roads now, better connectivity to the passes, to our operational areas where our troops are deployed. And I would like to say that we are in a better position now to meet any sort of challenges in the future.
Coming back to Agnipath and the idea that has seen a lot of commentary in the context of the Russia-Ukraine war about one of the reasons that the Russian army seems to be struggling in Ukraine is the excessive use of conscripts, and the fear that if you've got people with less training, then you end up in the kind of situations that the Russian army has, where tanks are getting stuck in sludge and mud, and they're not able to achieve their battle objectives because they have an army largely made up of conscripts. How relevant a concern is that, General Kalita, in the Indian context?
No, I had mentioned this earlier that we are going to have a healthy mix of youth and experience. So it's going to be around, say, 1:1, so if I put a ratio to it. And that is how it is being looked at. In any case, in case of operational requirement, in the scheme, the provision always exists to tweak the scheme with the approval of the Ministry of Defense and Finance. So whatever policy has been made, that is not cast in stone. There may be some changes in case required based on the operational requirement. And any constructive suggestions which are being received from the environment are being considered, and they are being put into place, I'm sure, to improve the scheme further.
One of the things that we've seen, which is very heartening after Agnipath, is that whether it is state governments or big companies, they've come forward to say that we will hire these Agniveers once they retire from the armed forces on priority. But a lot of veterans refer to ex-servicemen hiring data to suggest, look at the actual track record of state governments, of Central Armed Police Forces, of India Inc. in hiring actual Jawans who retired in the past. If they didn't do it in the past, how confident are you, General Kalita, that all these different bodies, organizations and institutions will hire retired army personnel in the future?
There are positive sides of the story as well. It will be incorrect to say that the retiring people are not being absorbed in the jobs. The numbers may be less, but this time around, I think most of the government ministries as well as corporate houses have given assurances of reserving about 10 to 20% of their total quota of intake for the Agniveers, that is the ex-servicemen. And we are confident that this should be followed through.
We're out of time on this session. It's been very significant that we could have this conversation with you on the Agnipath scheme, given the amount of news this is generated, given the kind of protest that this is seen. It is important to have an armed forces which is lean, tech-enabled, and has the kind of fighting skills that global armies do. And in that sense, we're moving in the right direction with the scheme. And we thank you, General Kalita, for taking out time and joining us here at the India Today East Conclave.
Thank you very much, Rahul. And wish you all the best.
Can we have a warm round of applause for the Eastern Army Commander, General Kalita, please? Thank you very much.
Thank you.